Morning, everybody. What kind of document were we going to have after the revolution to govern ourselves? Well, that was a big question, and a lot happened in those years after the revolution, particularly with the experiment of the Articles of Confederation. But eventually, the new Constitutional Convention met, and on this date, September 17, in 1787, the Constitution was signed. About a week after the Declaration of Independence, an Articles of Confederation were proposed for the country and ratified 5 years later. So when the final treaty with England was signed in 1783, the Treaty of Paris, there was a document in place known as the Articles of Confederation. So Congress met at what was known as the New York City Hall, later named Federal Hall. Was demolished in 1812. And as Congress started its deliberation, it became clear that the Articles of Confederation had many weaknesses, and you can see those are listed on the left. For instance, there was no national court system. Congress had no power to enforce its laws. It couldn't even collect taxes. And then there was the kind of existential question of who should have more power, the state governments or the central governments. And this all had to be figured out in those early years of the country. Interesting that in 1786, New Jersey, for example, simply refused to do something Congress said. So that was kind of unworkable. And then in Massachusetts, 1786, 1787, with Shays' Rebellion, farmers did some protesting against taxes and banks and things. So there was a feeling that things needed to be fixed. So when the group met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, the original plan was to fix the Articles, but then they said, we need a whole new document. So the Constitutional Convention met here, Independence Hall. Many of you have been there. And over the summer, there were all kinds of discussions. Delegates would come and go. And James Madison kept a diary, and today these are known as the Notes on the Federal Convention. Gives real insights into the discussions that the delegates had working on the Constitution. You might recall from civics or government class, the big states favored one plan, the small states favored another plan, and then the compromise was reached where the Senate has equal representation and the House is based on population, known as the Great Compromise. Now, the Constitution also dealt with slavery, although the word slave or slavery, those words are not in the Constitution. And I've written out the three areas where the Constitution dealt with slavery and protected it in many ways. Another thing the framers cooked up was the Electoral College, which mystifies many Americans and most of the world, I think. But we still have it today, and it's part of our system. So here's our event, September 17, 1787. 37 delegates signed the Constitution, but what about a Bill of Rights? And this was a big debate among all kinds of people. Should there be a Bill of Rights added to that original Constitution? So as the states began ratifying the Constitution, Delaware the first, Rhode Island the last, many said we need a Bill of Rights before we will ratify, and that's what happened. So a Bill of Rights, those 10 amendments were added to the Constitution. Now, the Constitution never mentioned political parties, and we've had political parties almost from the beginning. Democrats and Republicans, of course, what we have today, but there have been others. Another thing that the Constitution doesn't mention is the cabinet. So that's an example of a custom that is ingrained in our way of doing government, but not technically in the Constitution. And then who gets to interpret the Constitution? The Constitution itself doesn't say, but over the years, the Supreme Court has taken that role, and we call that judicial review. So if you've been to D.C., you've probably been to the archives, perhaps you've reflected on our great documents like the Constitution that continue to govern us today. Lots of discussion.